So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next in the series of the Culture Conversations. If you've been with us on this journey, you'll know that over the last few weeks, we've been talking on these webinars about the effect of the pandemic on company culture, on employee experience, on employee communications. We've talked about how businesses can innovate and how you can keep yourselves and your team fit and well during the crisis. Today, we're going to talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. What the current state of play is, what we think the impact of COVID has been, and see how the ED&I agenda is evolving as we start returning to work and then start to return to some kind of normal, I guess. I'm fortunate enough today to be joined by two professionals in diversity and inclusion space, Chris Wright and Susan Pupula. Welcome.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I wanted to start by saying, even before COVID, there was a real mixed bag in terms of the level at which companies were addressing and engaging with ED&I. You know, for some clients, we were helping them just get kick-started with their strategy and start thinking about it. At the other end of the spectrum, we were doing kind of quite progressive, immersive events powered by technology. So there was a real kind of range as to how much of a priority that was, how and to what extent companies were kind of really engaging. I think if I think back to a talk I gave at IBM last year on the D&I landscape, I was very much talking about how there's this kind of, the three tiers, the people that are, really haven't engaged at all, the people in the middle doing something, but maybe not necessarily the right things and not looking at the right outcomes that they needed from it. And then there were the progressive ones. And I'm not going to go through that talk in detail, but one of the things I did do for that was pull out some statistics. So one thing that is clear is that ED&I is good for people and it's good for business. And I think the people side, for the most part, is understood, but the business side, not so much. And so just a few of the stats that I pulled out that said that companies that have diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue. Racially and ethnically diverse companies outperform industry norms by 35%, and inclusive companies are 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders in their market. So it just goes to show that there very much is that business side to it as well. So I'm now going to ask my guests to introduce themselves, and then we're going to go through our discussion for today. So Susan, would you like to go first?
Hi everyone, I'm Susan Pupula. I'm a human value optimization specialist, run a company, Mosaic Fusions, and work with organizations on transformation programs, coaching and mentoring, supporting them to develop an inclusive team, taking account of that mosaic of people available to them with various talents, capabilities, skills, which ultimately enables them to be more productive in what they do.
Lovely, thank you. And Chris?
Okay. Morning, my name's Chris Wright. I'm primarily a talent management and diversity and inclusion specialist. And in doing so, what I tend to do is focus very much, as you say, Joe, on the business benefits, the business case for ED&I, because the moral and the traditional side of ED, I think, is well understood, but it's actually translating that into benefits for business and economic development that's very important. And I've been doing this roughly for about 18 to 20 months. So that's pretty much me.
Excellent. Okay, and I think that leads us nicely into, like, as I mentioned, we've been talking a lot about kind of company values, how you keep those alive over the pandemic, the culture, the employee experience, how it feels to be going through this. It'd be really interesting to get your take from an ED&I perspective on what you think companies have done well over this period and what they've done not so well in kind of managing the crisis, the remote working, those kinds of things.
I think the key thing is comms, in being able to keep yourself communicated into the team, making sure that diverse groups are not siloed, and just generally making sure that ED&I is still seen as relevant and practical, so that when the economy, let's say, begins to return to what's probably going to be a new normal, then ED&I continues to be an interesting, an interested area to look into, and not just seen as something that is more policy based or a tick box exercise, which is what we've had for quite some time previously.
Yes, definitely. And I've definitely seen a real mixed bag of kind of broadcast comms, not really factoring any sort of personalization or different situations that people might be experiencing, versus kind of nuanced, more sort of empathetic comms that's maybe a bit like, okay, you might be at home with your kids having this kind of situation, you might be a carer, you might be over here, where there's just been that sort of allowance for actually, how can I make this resonate with everybody? Yeah. What have you seen, Susan?
So I would say organizations really doing things well have taken the time to say, what do we do as an organization? How can we practically do this with our employees working from home? Looking at different people's roles and their personal circumstances, and therefore considering who does what and how, what is put on the side for the time being, or how it's reviewed. So that's a starting point. From there, key is the communication, but the communication is at different levels. There is that top level, broad strategic communication. This is where we are, what we're doing. There is also that one-to-one communication with individuals, where organizations, leaders that have really done well within this time have taken the time to really get to know their employees, know who they are as people, know what they're interested in, what they have to offer, their personal circumstances, and how they've therefore been able to review how people work to reflect that. And then with the communication, it's not just communicating with employees that are still working, but it's also remaining some form of contact with employees that they have furloughed, who are not an active part of the team, but they still want to come back and be involved going forward. So that's crucial. The challenge that I've seen some organizations have had when it comes to that whole area of communication is getting the balance right. Some have over communicated and almost got into the form of meetings all the time and every time, so that people hardly have time to actually do any work. So those are
that's not so good. No, it's an interesting one, and we always say that the communication should be two-way. I think that the whole piece about actually hearing the feedback from the individuals, is this working for you? How are you feeling? What's going on for you right now? Is there something that we could do better? I think it's crucial. I mean, it's important at the best of times, but especially when people might be suffering.
Yeah. And I think from that, when we're thinking of the whole ED&I perspective of things, it's also taking account of what time, when we do have crucial meetings, like those team meetings, to keep everyone connected. What time of the day do we have those meetings to account for different circumstances? Because someone with looking after a child, male or female, might not be able to do so at a particular time of the day. So having that consensus of when, and also thinking about the style of communication as well, because there's also the more introverted person, the more extroverted person. And one might need a more focused meeting than the other, who might be interested in something which is much more relaxed, more flexible. So there's that whole thing about getting the balance, learning to get that balance in communications as well.
I think the introvert-extrovert thing has been quite interesting, because on one level, I would have thought, well, people have said, the introverts love this. They've loved lockdown because they've been able to, to be at home working where they're happiest and no interruptions. But at the same time, I think that communication piece is even harder because they're then somehow not being factored into the equation quite as much. So some examples were, at the very beginning of this, people said, right, we're still going to have fun. We're going to have a Friday night pub quiz over Zoom, and everyone has to get involved. You know, it's mandatory attendance. Well, that may not suit the large majority of introverts to be doing that. So I think it took a while for that dynamic to ease out. And then I saw sort of smaller interest groups popping up. You know, maybe it was just films that they liked or something else where they could discuss in a small group. So they still had that social interaction, but it wasn't this big sort of showy display, I guess.
And I've also seen those where people have meetings, either even a formal meeting or something informal, where it's bring your child to work, so to speak. So they bring their child or their pet or someone within their household, something along with them, which also helps in terms of getting to know your team.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like by the time we get back, people will know each other very well. They'll know everything about people's personal situations, which may be good or bad, I'm not sure. But the FOMO piece is a really interesting one. So I think now as we start to think about, you know, yes, everybody's hailing the pandemic as having done really well for remote working, which is obviously part of flexible working, which fits into this whole agenda. So, but it's one piece and it's kind of, oh, hasn't that done well? Remote working's happened overnight, and that's true. And I think the reason that it's worked so well, one, that we've been forced into it, obviously, but the other is that everyone has been in the same boat. So everybody's been remote working. And so that's that kind of, we're all in it together, as in we're all on our own, but together. Where I see some sort of disconnects appearing now is maybe as we start to drift back into the office or back into the workplace, or at least some are. So some will be full-time, some will be on shift patterns, some will stay remote working. The latest statistic I saw actually said that 30% of people now will continue to remote work, which I think is amazing. But what I do see might happen is a little bit of a them and us culture reappearing for those groups that kind of are collecting in the office and seeing each other face to face, vis-a-vis those who are still remote working. I don't know, Chris, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I can fully see your point. What I would say is that getting people, and I know we're probably going to come on to this later, but getting people enabled with tech in this case is quite important, because if you think about what we're doing this morning, I recorded a webinar through Zoom, then it still allows for a level of interaction. You can have advanced meetings, you can do all sorts of things with various bits of tech that's readily available and fairly cheap now. So I think trying to, rather than just seeing going back into either staying at home or going back into the office as two separate things, it's about how do you integrate the two modes of working to make sure people are still connected, things are still relevant, and actually making sure that those people that are working from home or working from a different location still have influence on their teams, and this is something that I've obviously been doing reasonably successfully, to I have to say to varying degrees, for the last 18 to 20 months.
Yeah, excellent. And any tips as someone who has been doing that for for a while now? Any tips on kind of helping people manage it?
I would always say, I mean, I'm quite lucky in being quite a disciplined person, but make sure, if you do have the luxury, shall we say, of being able to structure your day because you are home working, make sure you structure your day, if you can, to give yourself a level of variety of tasks. I mean, obviously, given the level of client work at particular times, it's difficult to do so because you've got things coming in constantly. But if you can structure your day in different ways, make sure you still get, you know, the regular, as we always say, statutory exercise that has been going on during COVID, and give yourself different experiences while still working, I think is quite important to make sure you get some level of variety
Yeah, perfect.
involved.
And Susan, what do you think about this dynamic, the kind of the people that you see face to face? It's very easy for people to be lazy. That's my concern when you know, when they're in the office and they're like, oh, who are those people working from home?
I mean, it is an interesting one because one thing that has come up with people working from home is you get to a point where there's nowhere to hide, which actually sounds a bit contradictory in a way because you can't be seen. But it has meant that there is a move away from, I was here from 9 to 5, so the inputs of hours to outputs. What are your outcomes? What are you actually achieving? What have you done? So you're more accountable for outputs than for how much time you were working for. So that is one key thing that comes up with this, and I hope we continue in that mode. So focusing on not the how, but the what in terms of what you achieve. I think leadership is crucial going forward, because what I mean, more or less adding to what Chris has already said, it's almost forming a hybrid in terms of working from home and working in the office. So even people that work from home might work in the office at times. Those working in the office might work from home. But the key is specifically using technology. How do we develop a situation where we can make sure that whenever we're having meetings, either you say, an old-fashioned way would say everyone has to come into an office for meetings, but rather than that, in line with what's already been done for a long time, how do we make sure we have a meeting where there are people physically in a room, but also it's done in a way that other people that aren't there physically can log on to join into the meeting and that conversation? How do we make sure that when we have discussions about things in the office, that they are just discussions, but we're not making firm decisions without involving those that work from home, which is why, again, it points to the leadership. And it's really a key leadership responsibility of managing that dynamic between the two, plus individuals also taking responsibility, recognizing that everyone has a value that they add. And therefore, if we're making decisions without these people, if we're just doing things without them, we're not getting the full benefit of the team. So those are keys that come to my mind. But it's also interesting. I don't know whether you've picked up from the news recently, but Google and Facebook have said, regardless of the end of a lockdown, employees can work from home till the end of the year. And Twitter has just announced that you can work from home as long as you want to. I will add, probably as long as that works with your role. And that's something for other organizations to think of as well.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, if there's no real need to rush back and it's working and people are productive, then, you know, I mean, I really do hope that this is the end, that it spells the end for presenteeism, you know, which was still in a lot of industries was still very, you know, prevalent. I mean, that whole kind of, well, what time did you clock in? What time did you clock off? I mean, that has no bearing in this day and age on how productive you were or how much work you got done. And by the same token, I know we mentioned a few weeks ago about leavism, where people can't actually leave their work at work. Well, now this sort of blurred line of where you do your work from, you know, could be anywhere. I think people will have to set their own boundaries. And to Chris's point, you know, they need to be disciplined. You know, these are the tasks I'm doing now, and this is time where I'm resting, or this is my leisure time. This is something else. So
I still remember some years back, I did some work with an organisation, and there was a young lady had come back from maternity leave. She wanted to work part-time. In fact, she'd started working on a part-time basis, and she worked some days at home and some days in the office. A new manager joined and said, "You can't do that. How can you look after a baby and work from home?" And my thought was, talk to her, because you need to understand how she works. Because I'd had that dialogue with her, back to that communication thing and that dialogue thing, because what she would do is wake up very early in the morning, do some work, child is up, pay attention to child, husband comes back home from work, do more work in the evening, and her outputs were higher because her focus was on what needs to be done, as opposed to how many hours I've worked. And it's funny because, as we all know, we're now in the position where everyone who has children or care responsibilities in general is having to do that.
Yeah, and making it work. You know, I mean, it might not be ideal for everyone, but if that's what you wanted to do, or you couldn't afford expensive childcare costs and you could make that work, you know, why not? I mean,
yeah. And the key is making it work. The key is making it work. So it's not just saying you're doing it, but it's being able to do it at a practical level as well, and being honest about that.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Susan, about inclusive leadership, I mean, I think that's the skill, right? I mean, the kind of the next generation leader that we need. I mean, that we have lots of things about how they can be innovative. You know, they need to be resilient and adaptable, and they need to be looking at the business today as well as looking into the future. But one of them is that whole sort of fostering diversity and cognitive diversity, you know, in their teams, understanding, you know, how can I get the most out of everybody? How can I get the best out of all the people that I've got there? I think it's key. We might come back to that in a bit, but then I was going to pick up on Chris's point again about technology. So I think technology in this sense falls into a couple of different camps. I think there's, what have we seen that's worked really well in terms of, you know, productive technology, in terms of keeping us connected, keeping people engaged, keeping them productive. You know, what's really worked well over this time. And then I think there's technology more broadly in this space for what are people doing that's progressive, you know, that's out there, that kind of what should they be using, what's the next stage. So Chris, I don't know if you want to go first on that one.
We can start off in two ways. I think the first way is, how do you keep people connected? Well, using platforms like this, as I think I've already said on 2 or 3 occasions, even during this webinar. But secondly, in terms of using tech as I do, in ways that just aren't seen as ED&I specific. I'm talking to you, for example, today, and to the wider world, through a laptop which is on an easy riser stand. I've got a full-blown Plantronics headset that's linked into both my laptop and my mobile phone. I often use Dragon Naturally Speaking to dictate documents and emails, and that's around 3 to 4 times faster than standard typing. So there are ways of making the wider workforce, various talent pools, etc., more productive by using tools that were specifically developed for ED&I purposes to a large extent across the board. If only organizations would look at the business case for diversity across the board rather than just for specific groups. I mean, I know that in certain cases specific decisions do need to be made, but trying to broaden out the case for a diversity, almost diversity-based organization where it's more widespread and more business focused, I think is very important.
Yeah. Susan?
Oh, Chris almost took the words out of my mouth. And I echo what he says. I mean, and he's talking about it from an experience base. I've seen it as well, the type of technology that Chris uses, and there is most definitely value in using that more widely. So it really is a way of demonstrating the power of diversity and and being inclusive in approach, because that technology that Chris uses could be used for any of us and enhance our productivity. But you have to be inclusive in approach in terms of talking to people to understand what is it that you need, Chris, Joe, or whoever, in order to be more effective, and then making other people aware and making those things available to other people. So, I mean, that is key. I mean, I think we all also know that Zoom is now in the vocabulary of everyone. I think everyone knows what Zoom is now, probably 3 months.
You've forgotten about Skype, that was yesterday.
Yeah,
it's gone.
And there are others as well, but Zoom, everyone, everything is now done on Zoom. But crucially with technology, something key that has come to mind with all of these things is we've long been talking about the future of work and what it would look like. And a lot of those things have now come to the fore. And it's a matter of people have been quietly developing things in silos for small groups of people in different spaces. And now it's a time where we found ourselves trialing those things. And the key is with where we are now, those things that have worked well, great. How do we further develop them? And what additional technology do we need for purposes like this and beyond? So it's bring on the future of work, especially using technology to enhance who we are, what we do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of the really sort of progressive things that I mean, they still exist now, but I started to say when we were running our immersion events, which are obviously very live kind of physical events that you need to be at, but we were starting to use a lot of virtual reality for what could it look like, or what would it like. So we mostly be taking top teams into kind of very immersive environments and showing them what it would feel like to be a wheelchair user, for argument's sake, in their office space. So how easy would it be to swipe your badge on the pass to get through the door and then actually still open the door? Or how easy is it to access the printer? Or how easy, you know, and it's only then that people have that kind of eureka moment of, oh, right, oh, actually, well, there are these 4 steps at the front of the building that there's no possible way you could get up, kind of. But until they're actually presented with that as a challenge, you know, it's very difficult for them to kind of get their heads around. And even I think the kind of tools that are available in terms of hiring by profile, so kind of ditching the CV. Let's ditch the CV because it kind of tells you too much about somebody for you to have too much, you know, allow too much unconscious bias, even if that's through the AI that's been programmed by somebody with unconscious bias. Excuse me. But purely that profile then of who should be on this team, who should we hire, who should be on this team, who should get the promotion, who should get these, you know, based on what are your skills, capabilities, your potential, your everything else about you. Where are you going to add value in this without necessarily looking at age, where you've come from, you know, anything else, which I think is really good. You know, it's not quite there yet, but we're starting to see that be used more and more. So
I completely agree, and I think we do need to move towards more inclusive, you know, ways of looking into either recruitment or development in ways that are not just focused on CVs or purely on experience levels, but actually what skills can you bring to the table, how much innovation potential does someone have, what are their, again, as Susan was saying earlier, what are their specific interests? How might they be able to help develop the organisation and help develop some of the ideas going forward that's actually going to lead us to something that's much more potentially interesting, dynamic and relevant than just going down routes that were previously, shall we say, pre-COVID normalized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even to the extent that, I was working with a financial services firm that was still saying, right, well, we need people who are absolutely excellent at maths. We need maths geeks, maths genius. So we're just going to Russell Group universities. And you go, okay, right, because that's the only place in the world where people who are good at maths are sitting. And there was that level of unconscious bias that, this is the only place, these are the only people. Obviously the brightest people go to these universities because everybody has access to those universities, of course, without even realizing what was wrong with saying that.
Yeah.
And I was saying you should put a maths test, a really difficult maths test, online. And if somebody passes that maths test, you should at least give them a telephone interview and see, just to broaden your, I'm always saying look for the untapped talent pools. Where could you go hunting for these people? And I think that's you've got to make an effort. Like, I don't know what you two think. Whether the COVID experience has kind of helped the untapped talent, bubble to the surface or not.
There will always be the variation in terms of how organizations have managed things, the communication and the type of communication which has created an awareness or not. But I would say for those who have had some open communication and being open in their approach, I would say most definitely. For instance, we touched earlier on the extrovert-introvert dynamic. The introvert that is normally beaving away quietly in their corner has been better recognized over this period than before, because that communication has taken place, the greater awareness of what you're doing. The person that doesn't normally shout out and say, look at me, this is what I'm doing. Well, that dialogue and the awareness of the outputs that has taken place. So that has helped on that front as well. So I would say most definitely to some extent, but there are still some processes and structures that get in the way, because almost going back to what you mentioned earlier on, what are we using to measure and determine whether someone is capable still comes to play. But at the same time, I was speaking to the chief executive of an organization who mentioned that he had to furlough some staff, and he did that on the basis of essential and non-essential roles. And in doing so, he found out that actually he's now got a 60% female workforce, which came as a shock.
Really interesting. Wow, okay.
As a shock to his system. We also know, looking at things more broadly, there's that whole thing of who's an essential worker, and that will apply to a bank, an insurance company, a professional service organization, just as much as everywhere else, where you realize that people that you've typically ignored and not seen as important are suddenly quite important within an organization.
Yeah, good point.
Can I just add to a few things? Completely agreeing with what you've both said previously, but just to add again a level of experience in terms of this work-life balance, which is now moving into work-life blending, I think, in a lot of cases, as people have often said. In terms of, from an ED&I perspective, with someone with experience in having to manage these things is quite important. Because if you think about it, I'm talking to someone with a physical disability. I have cerebral palsy and I'm a full-time wheelchair user, as you can probably see. But actually making sure that your life, let's say physical conditioning, for example, is of an appropriate level, as well as your work, is actually quite important, because doing those things, so some form of physio, exercise, making sure that basically you're in the right frame of mind when you get up in the morning, and on the days where everything has basically gone well, and I'm specifically thinking in terms of, if I can use the term, care needs, if all of that's gone well prior to starting work, it's a much better day than if it hasn't. And being able to be aware of what those specific changes might be in terms of your working patterns. I mean, I'm not saying that every organisation needs to be aware of everybody's specific circumstances all of the time, but at least having a level of flexibility in terms of the way, particularly a positive ED&I workforce goes about structuring their working patterns, is quite important for that, to provide some level of flexibility for different conditions. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I started up being a consultant when I did.
Susan, did you want to add something?
I was going to say that makes sense. I always talk about having a framework, organisers having a framework which says this is the frame within which we do things. This is the must, which relates to our culture, our values, our legal requirements and process. But then within that, there's the flexibility that takes account of individuals, how they work, individual needs, circumstances, and what is happening at a point in time. And I think that very much aligns to what you've just said, Chris.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and taking into account all of those different perspectives and needs, I think is very important, while respecting people's individual preferences to disclose and necessarily discuss these things should they wish to, and when they may be necessary, obviously with that caveat. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I was a judge on the for the D&I awards last year, and a lot of the time with these things, you just see the kind of initiative approach. Here's a sort of initiative we had to roll out. Here's another people network that we've set up. But the people that we chose to win the award had almost taken, they didn't articulate it very well actually, but what they did was amazing, and it was almost that they'd taken an approach of what changes could we make to suit the people who were available, kind of approach. And they didn't word it like that at all, but they called it a Movis, and I think they managed the tolls on all the motorways, but they sort of said, okay, who is unemployed in Leeds, I think it was, in the area, who's unemployed, and why are they unemployed? What could they do? So there were people that had been a long time there. So there were some people with disabilities where the employer hadn't been willing to accommodate. So it wasn't that they couldn't do the job, and so they said, okay, well, we can hire partially sighted people into our call centres because they're on the phones all day. So as long as we give them the technology to read out what they need from the information on the screen, etc., then that's fine. So they put that technology in place. They hired people with autism who wanted to work from home, didn't want to be in the office, who wanted to do repetitive tasks that nobody else wanted to do, basically, knew where they stood. So they were manually checking the number plates that the technology didn't pick up. The list goes on. I know they made it a suitable environment for blind dogs as well. And I just think it's a completely different approach. And I wonder, I don't know whether you have any other good examples of good, or what good looks like, or any thoughts on what you think employers could do, or we could do to help employers kind of shift to that way of thinking? Like, that seems like quite an extreme scenario in a lot of ways, but rather than just have these kind of, this week we've got this kind of initiative for this population, how can you kind of shift to this, we're going to accommodate you no matter what? Or am I dreaming? Is this
I don't think so. I mean, and that's why I talk about starting with a framework of what we do. That there's also that thing of if you bring one or two people in. I mean, so actually, even before you start talking about bringing people in, there is that thing of getting people together within the organization, having an open culture, which means that people can make suggestions or bring forth ideas. Having the idea that we want to talk about whatever type of diversity, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's people from an ethnic background, religion, disability. Let's have a group that has a discussion. It could be that you already have people within your workplace from that group. It could be people that live with people who are within that group, and others, and just generally having a discussion of what can be done, what are the possibilities, making it clear when it comes to recruitment that you're open to anyone from whatever group or background applying for a role, and that you will do whatever you can to accommodate them, and listening to what they have to say, what the needs are, and being open to making the changes, not just for their benefit, but for the wider organization, as we've mentioned earlier. So it's not insurmountable, and it's probably not as difficult as people might think it is. It's starting off with the will and recognizing that there is value in doing so.
Yeah,
absolutely. I totally agree. I certainly think that this is the way we need to go. And one thing I would point out, having remembered the point I was actually going to make, is that I think there needs to be an understanding of, that in a lot of these cases, if you're talking about managing specific needs for whichever diverse group you are talking about, in whatever focus group population you want to get together, it's not about trying to force a combination of those needs onto the organization. It's about how can we work around these specific needs of the organization, but also for the specific needs of the workforce, employee, worker, self-employed contractor, etc., etc. And I think as soon as we've moved that debate on from saying, well, this is about trying to get around a condition and trying to make our workforces more inclusive in the traditional sense, as soon as you bring the business element back into it and start thinking, well, how can we literally almost take away any boxes and move it out to a net as such, and then say, well, how can we essentially rebuild from that point upwards, I think is very important. Obviously, while not taking care not to take away the absolute fabric of everything, but at least moving in this direction, I think is helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, what was interesting, we all sort of, rushed out of the workplace, everything kind of just came to a very quick kind of ending, quick get out. And I think in this, now after these 50 odd days, whatever it's been, that we're in lockdown and people start to sort of trickle back into the workplace, I think there's that element of just being a bit more considered about it and a bit more thoughtful. And I think it'd be interesting to hear what you guys think are, what's the greatest risk as we start to do that, and what's the biggest opportunity for ED&I as we kind of start this new normal phase that we're leading into?
2 points. They may be two extremes here. So
that's okay.
To which I apologise. So, but the first, I think, is that we're going to move into a new normal practically, but when we get back into organisations, we essentially go back to the old normal in terms of our way of thinking, apart from the odd bit of remote working, home working, however flexible practices need to be put in place because of the, let's say, the Coronavirus Act and the 2-year switch on, switch off that the authorities can basically apply. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think it provides, and this is certainly where I hope we're going to get to, is that it allows this period of reflection as such for both individuals and for organizations, allows us to get to a much better place where all of these things we've been discussing for years, both in terms of research and practice, can actually now come together, and we can actually bind practical steps together to make sure that we can get towards fully inclusive, productive, business-friendly workplaces.
In many ways, to add to that, I think crucial is the learning. The best thing we can do is take the learning. The worst thing we can do is lose the learning and just go back to where we were. 'Cause I think there's a reality. We're talking about, across the world, we're talking about coming out of the lockdown and going back to normal. Actually, we're not. We're easing out of the lockdown. We don't know for sure that everything's going to go smoothly and that we're not going to have to step back again. Even if it does go smoothly, it's not going to be an overnight change to go back to a previous or a new position. It's a long term. It's going to take quite some time for that to happen. Hopefully, this will never happen again, but there's no guarantee that we wouldn't have another virus even when we've sorted this out, or something else within our system that will throw us again. So all of that makes it crucial for us to not just think, we've done it, it's over, we move forward. So that is why it's crucial to take the time to review what has taken place, what have we done, how has it worked for people, to do the surveys, to have the group discussions, and what has been most productive, what has been most effective, how have people coped and different people coped to manage things, and how do we move forward to create what Chris has just described, which I couldn't describe any better.
Perfect, excellent. Well, on that note, I think we're coming to the end of the webinar for today. Is there anything that either of you would like to add before we wrap up for today?
For me, I think there is something crucial, because just going back to that original question about equality, diversity, and inclusion, and is it the beginning, is it the end, or is it the beginning? I'm truly hoping that people do see it as the beginning. There is that whole CSR, moral side of things. And I think one thing that we've seen is how different groups and different people, from a gender perspective, from should I say social economic perspective, from an ethnicity perspective, how people have been affected differently, and some people will have really been challenged within that. So if we're talking about diversity inclusion, then we need to think about that if we're thinking of it from a CSR perspective. CSR also extending to the climate when we talk about flexible working. But going further than that, there is also the benefit to organizations, which hopefully organizations have begun to realize from how different people have interacted, how certain people, certain roles have been more productive, and we've seen what's essential to an organization. And even organizations that haven't yet realized those things, hopefully they'll look outwards and see what's happening in other organizations, other spaces, and also learn, pick up and learn.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah.
Chris, any final words from you?
Yeah, I certainly hope that we take the learnings, we move forward to essentially what is a new normal or a new way of working, exactly in the way that Susan has said, but almost turning this back to where we started, really, that we continue to, and certainly for in terms of innovation, moving from what's been I think there's always been a fairly large minority, shall we say, of organizations that have been quite reactive in terms of the way that they dealt with, whether it be ED&I or people practices more generally. But we move towards a much more proactive way forward, as I know that people like yourself and Susan and myself have been advocating for quite some time.
Exactly. Well, let's hope so. I want to say a huge thank you to both of you today for joining us on the conversation. There's some optimism for the future, I feel, so I look forward to working with you both on some ED&I projects in the very near future.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.